Welcome to the Argo Navis conference, the Follow the Stars conference. It's great to have you here. It's great to be able to see you in person. Read so much about you and try to understand your focus in life and your ambition and so on. So thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon. We've had some great speakers so far. We've really had some value for money. So thanks a lot for joining us. And clearly, from a Cambrian Mountains perspective, we are one of the darkest places in Wales. It's a landscape. Which have you been to Wales, John?
I have not.
You must come to Wales after today, okay? Don't come tomorrow because I'm not free tomorrow to take you around. But if you can come to Wales sometimes in the next 5 years, come and try and find me, pin me down, and I'll show you the best that Wales has to offer, especially the dark skies of the Cambrian Mountains. And we've got 9 dark sky discovery sites here. And of course, as you probably know, we've got the Elan Valley International Dark Sky Park as well, which is technically the beating heart of all things dark skies here in the Cambrian Mountains. So as I understand it, you used to be with the International Dark Sky Association. Not anymore?
Not anymore, just quite recently. I've started my own environmental consultancy, and I'm doing this work as a freelancer, essentially.
Oh, I like that phrase, freelancer. I feel as if I'm freelancing today as well. But yeah, thanks to the conference organizers. It's great to meet people. It's great to be part of a 2-day event. So I'm happy to hand over to you, John. Whatever method you have of presenting your story, your information, we can help with that as well in terms of sharing the screen. The cat now is there. Anyway, and I'll keep an eye on. I'll keep an eye on the chat and on the Q questions as well. But it's great to have you as part of the Argo Navis Follow the Stars conference for these 2 days in October 2021. Over to you, John.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. I appreciate that. And I am going to go ahead and put up my slides. So let me get that started. I hope everybody can see this now. So as David mentioned, my name is John Barantine, and I am a freelancer now. I put my company as my main affiliation here on my title slide, but I also put 2 other organizations with which I am either currently or formerly affiliated. One is, of course, the International Dark Sky Association that David mentioned that has made some important dark sky designations in Wales. And I'm also affiliated with a group called the Consortium for Dark Sky Studies at the University of Utah here in the United States, where we founded the world's first academic center that's dedicated to the scientific study of this issue. I am an astronomer by training, my background, and my interest in this subject has a lot to do with wanting to bring this experience to as many people as possible. So that's why I've dedicated my professional life to the propagation of the idea of dark skies and why we should protect them. So today what I'm going to talk to you about is something that's very, very relevant to Wales, and that is the notion of whether Wales is or can be a dark sky nation. What does that mean? And I want to put Wales in the context of a global movement to solve the problem of light pollution. So since we're going to go on a journey together over about the next 45 minutes or so, here's an outline of my talk. This is the roadmap. First, I'm going to tell you why Wales is special in regard to dark skies, but also why it is threatened. I will tell you about the International Dark Sky Association and its mission. Then I will explain how we conserve dark landscapes. How do we actually make these places persistent through time? And then I'll move on in the last section of the talk to describe the significance of Wales in this context and discuss the idea of this dark sky nation and how we can get there. So first, I'm sure I don't need to tell you as people who live in Wales why the country is special, but I will dwell on that idea for a moment. And it is for this reason, among others, is that there are still many places in Wales where nighttime scenes like this one can be found. This is a photo taken by Carl Jones on Anglesey. There's just a little bit of a glow in the background there in the lower right from towns on the mainland, but really what you see in this image is the glorious Milky Way standing almost vertically there just to the left of center, and quite literally hundreds, if not thousands of stars. And this is something that sets Wales apart from a lot of Western Europe, to be honest, is that there are very few places left in Europe where you can see sites like this on a regular basis. And for that reason, I think it sets Wales apart and it makes it a special place. So that's the premise that I'm starting from, is that we have something special in Wales that is worth protecting. And a lot of the rest of the talk will relate to that. How do we do that? How do we make sure that views like this are accessible to our distant descendants, the people who will come after us by many generations? But there was a time when this was not the exception, rather it was the rule. And every human once shared this experience in this photo. When I give a version of this talk in person, I always ask the audience, I start by saying, how many people can remember a time before there was an internet? And of course, most of the hands go up except for the children. And then I say, okay, how many people can remember a time before television? Because in the evening when it got dark outside, till recently, that's what a lot of us did. We would come inside, turn on television, and that's how we spent our evenings together. And at that point, many fewer hands are raised. There aren't as many people who remember a time before television. And then I asked them, well, what did we do before television? And they might say, well, we listened to the radio. And then I'll ask, how many people remember a time before radio? And none of those people are living now. And then I say, well, before radio, what did we do? And people had different suggestions. And some said, well, we might sit inside and read books, maybe by candlelight. And I would say, yes. And what did we do before books? And the idea is, as we go backward in the history of technology, we enter an earlier time when the lives of humans were rather different than they are now. And for the vast sweep of human history, this picture shows what people did together at night. They sat around the campfire. This is something that humans did for literally hundreds of thousands of years. The fire was good for us. It helped us cook our food. It helped keep predators away. It gave us light where we could see each other in the darkness. And we told stories around the campfire. A lot of the human folklore in its earliest beginnings probably originated in environments like this, where people were crowded together. There wasn't a lot else to do, and we communed around the fire and we began to tell our stories. And later in the night, as the fire began to die down, naturally people would have looked up into the night sky and they would have seen something like this. Remember that artificial light is a very recent invention in human history. We have only had it for about the last 130 years. And so there wasn't any light to make its way into the night sky with any significance. And so every human everywhere in the world had access to a night sky that was similar to this one, in which there were thousands of stars from horizon to horizon. And we looked at that night sky and we projected ourselves onto it. And as a result, we placed our heroes among the stars. So here is an example of the constellation that's known in the West as Orion. It's very familiar to anybody who has looked at the night sky in the winter, and many cultures interpret these stars as a human figure, and specifically as some type of heroic human figure. This is a version from a German star atlas published in about 1690. And it shows a sort of late medieval to Enlightenment figure holding a shield and a club. And of course, there are many other patterns in the background, other constellations that are also noted. But these are human inventions. There's no specific rhyme or reason to the placement of the stars in the night sky. It's really a random pattern. But one thing that humans are especially good at is finding structure in the noise. We find patterns in things. And once we started picking out the bright stars in the night sky, it was only natural that we would begin making figures out of them. And some of these are probably very ancient. You'll notice up in the upper left corner of that map, there is a constellation called Taurus, the bull. There are some indications that Taurus may have been identified as a constellation perhaps 20,000 years ago during the Ice Age. So this is something that goes very far back into our human prehistory and has loomed large over us until very recently, as we have slowly begun to lose those stars due to light pollution. And the natural night sky, as I put here in parentheses, still inspires Britain. Everything from the world famous Stonehenge over there on the left to medieval astronomy, which was practiced with vigor in Britain. And then over on the right is the Jodrell Bank Radio Observatory. That's an example of how Britain still looks to the night sky, in this case in radio wavelengths, to try to understand it better. So it's part of the country's heritage. And I think in that it's very much worth preserving. But Britain's night skies are threatened. There's no getting around that fact. I've pulled some headlines here, and the Campaign to Protect Rural England's great star count that it does every year to try to understand better the extent of light pollution, at least in England. This is not news. Anybody who has paid attention to the media in the last several years is at least somewhat familiar. One of the headlines there, the first one in BBC about light pollution from street lamps is linked to insect loss. It's very recent. That was a paper that was published in August that made a media splash throughout Britain. So there is growing awareness that this is a problem. And I would argue that it is a problem that is not only worth solving, but one that is easy to solve. And while there's an increasing problem with light pollution across Britain, large parts of Wales remain dark. So what I'm showing you here on the right is a map with an overlay. So there is a physical map of Wales in the background made from satellite images. You can see the landscape beneath the false colors. And those false colors relate to the brightness of the night sky that would be seen by a person standing in any given location. And those colors range from a dark blue to almost gray, all the way up to yellows, orange, reds, and eventually pink. You'll see, especially up in the cities in the Northeast, in England, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, that the pink means that there's a lot of light. Those skies are very washed out by light pollution, whereas much of Wales is in those blues, especially the interior of the country. And this is what sets it apart. Otherwise, to find skies that are this dark, like in the mountainous interior of Wales, you have to go far up into Scotland, into the Hebrides or the Orkneys to find comparable dark skies. So this is part of why I think Wales is special. And I'll be coming back to this same picture later in the presentation to show you what's advantageous about it. But this problem of light pollution is not one that's specific to the UK. It's not one that is specific to the West. It is really now a global problem. So the same satellite data that were used to make that last image here have been combined for the entire world. It took more than a year to make this image, to ensure that stitching together these many thousands of images, that every place on the globe did not have any clouds. So it's only observing on the nights when there were no clouds in the given location. And you'll notice some things stand out, such as the continents that are distinct from the seas. The continents are lighter in color. That's because moonlight is illuminating them at different points during the year, and it makes them stand out from the oceans. But the other noticeable thing about this image is that kind of off-white or almost golden color that outlines a lot of the continents, which is the light from the world's cities. And so this is something that we literally see from space. It's not a problem that's simply at the level of the town in which you live. It's something that affects whole countries, or in some cases, whole continents. And now you can see, if you look just below the word global, and you can see Europe, you can see why exactly it is that Wales is different. You'll notice that there's a lot of that light coming from the countries in and all of Europe, really, but really concentrated in the West. Also, it stands out in places like the United States, here where I'm at this morning, India, Japan, certain parts of South America. And then you'll notice that a lot of the interiors of the continents are relatively dark. There's not as much of that city light. And that is telling us something about where people live, but it's also telling us something about the development level of those people. For example, I can assure you that there are over 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, but their light emission is nothing like the billion people who live in India, for example, or collectively the nearly billion people that live in North America and Europe. So it's also telling us something about the level at which people have access to resources like light at night, and the extent to which other cultures are using so much of it that it could be argued that that light is really waste. I've been using this term light pollution. You probably have heard it already so far in the conference. I always like to define anything that's otherwise unfamiliar. And this is my definition of light pollution. There's no single definition on which everyone agrees. This is the one that I like because I think it really identifies the problem. And it's any adverse effect or impact attributable to the use of artificial light at night. So there are two important parts of that definition. And the one is the cause, which is this thing called artificial light at night. That's suggested by the image in the foreground. It's all of this electric light that doesn't exist in nature. But it also uses the words adverse effect or impact. So what we're talking about is some negative aspect of the use of this light. And it's important to make that distinction because not all artificial light at night is properly considered pollution because it doesn't yield an adverse effect. There are many good reasons that we use artificial light at night, and they help our society in a number of ways. So it's not something where we can point at every instance of artificial light at night and say that is the problem. We don't need to turn all of the world's lights off in order to deal with it. But rather, what I will suggest to you is that we need to think differently about how we use all of this light at night. So what do we know now about light pollution? Since we've been studying it systematically for on about 25 years or so. These are some factoids that are pulled from a paper written by Fabio Falchi and coworkers in Italy about 5 years ago, based on satellite observations in the 5 years previous to that. So we're almost looking back 10 years now. And already by that time, about 80% of the world's population lived under night skies that were light polluted at some level. And of those, about a third of the people on the planet cannot see the Milky Way at night. And we use the Milky Way as an example because it's an indicator of a dark sky. Whether or not you can see it says something about the state of your night skies. And then almost 90% of Europe and half of the US populations experience what could be described as perpetual twilight, so that the night sky never reaches a natural level of darkness, and another indicator of the extent to which they live in light polluted places. So why is this happening? Well, fundamentally, it's because we're using far more light at night than we really need. If we were to reduce our consumption of light only to that which is really necessary, we would immediately take care of scenes like the one here in the background, where you have light emanating from buildings and lights from homes and buildings on the hillside in the distance, and so much light on the ground that you can see that the facades of the buildings are lit up. And a lot of that is ending up in the night sky. The sky above the city here should be dark. That background should be black and you should see stars. But instead, what you see is sort of a continuation of that same yellow-brown color that characterizes the nighttime setting in the city. A lot of the overuse of light is just waste. It's light that we don't need. It's light that is carelessly directed where it's not needed or wanted. And a lot of that wastefulness is simply because we're not aware of what we're doing with it. Light is cheap. It's easy to consume. You can buy light bulbs everywhere. The power to run them is inexpensive. And as with a lot of things in the history of the technology, whenever something becomes cheaper to consume, we tend to consume more of it and not less. And there are definitely indications that that is happening, resulting in the problem of light pollution. So why does this matter? And you've already heard some of this, so I won't go into any detail, but all of these topics that I've shown here are all directly connected to light pollution in one way or another. And in many respects, it's just the tip of the iceberg, as we say. The thing that may be most concerning for some people is the nexus with climate change, which is why I listed it first. That is the issue that will define this century for most humans. And even though we are using more renewable sources of energy to generate electricity and therefore to power light at night, we're still emitting a lot of carbon in order to generate electricity and light up our cities. And so to the extent that we're continuing to waste this light, it's contributing to this problem. But not everybody is so concerned about that. Many people are worried about crime and public safety and how artificial light at night affects that. And there's also the issue of wildlife. Even if you live in a city, you have wildlife and they are affected by all of this light. And we are all intimately connected in the web of life. So if we disrupt part of that web somewhere by conveying a disadvantage to certain species that are affected by our light at night, eventually that will make its way back to us. And so we just, again, need to think about this problem differently than we have thought about it before, and we could address all of these concerns. So next, I will tell you a little bit about the International Dark Sky Association and its mission, which is to confront this problem. So the IDA is a non-governmental organization that was founded here in the United States in the late 1980s. It's headquartered here in Tucson, Arizona, where I'm calling from this morning. There are about 7,000 supporters and financial donors to the organization worldwide, a number of chapters in different countries, advocates who are out there trying to press this message to the public, and a number of affiliate organizations. So IDA is the hub of the wheel, and all of these people at the grassroots level are the spokes that reach out to the different parts of the world and carry the organization's message. IDA's mission is to preserve and protect the nighttime environment and our heritage of dark skies through environmentally responsible outdoor lighting. And it's important that in this statement, it talks about heritage, I think. That's a key phrase that's in this mission statement, but also lighting. Again, the mission is not to turn the world's lights off as a method of solving the problem of light pollution. The method is getting people to think differently about how they use light, in the belief that they will require less of it if they are instructed in its proper use. And we have seen that, at least on a small scale, that when that message is conveyed to people and they really take it to heart, that really positive outcomes are possible. And it's simply by waste. It's not by making it darker or more dangerous for people at night, not by any means. It's more about keeping that light where it's needed and removing it from the places that it isn't. And I have down in parentheses a catchphrase that comes from the global environmental movement, to think globally while acting locally. And that's really the idea behind IDA as a relatively small organization, is that it can be the conduit of factual information, arguments in favor of solving the problem of light pollution. All that information then equips the advocates to go out there into the field and carry the message and try to convince, hopefully, the decision makers in society to make better decisions about how we're using light at night. That will get us closer to achieving the mission. IDA does a lot of things in support of this mission, and this is just a kind of a smorgasbord of some of the different activities in which it engages. Everything from dialogue with the lighting manufacturing community to improve the kinds of products that are on the commercial lighting market. There's a lot of education and public outreach, advocacy. I will talk more about the conservation programs in the next section of the talk, and in particular, and highlight those. IDA is involved in research to try to understand the problem better, and publishes a lot of information, makes that available to the public to help spread the word. But job number one for an organization like IDA, which is still, even 3 decades into its history, is still early in that history, relatively speaking, is to increase public awareness of this issue, to get more people interested in the topic, focused on it, hopefully converting them from awareness to eventually taking action. And these are just a few things that, an infographic, for example, the title slide to a presentation called Losing the Dark, a short 6-minute public service announcement that you can download on the IDA website, and trying to get some interaction with the media. They're our main conduit for helping get this information out to the public more broadly. So being available for journalist interviews and the like is an important part of what IDA does. So next, I want to move into the section of how IDA and other organizations conserve dark landscapes, because that will then be the lead into why we need to really focus more attention on whales. So the conservation of these dark places that remain in the world is part of the overall strategy of IDA. We cannot only deal with the dark places and try to save them without also dealing with the problem of the cities, because the two are intimately linked. And so what I'll describe in this scenario here is how we do both of those things. But to take a step back and to look into the history of conservation of nature generally, it comes down to, I think, these three broad concepts. First, we have to understand what our resource is. To conserve it, we need to understand it. We need to know what its value is to be able to communicate that to other people, to understand the significance of the resource when it is lost, and then eventually to come up with ways that we can deal with that loss and hopefully even reverse it. Once we have identified it, we need then to manage it. We need to develop best practices for how we save these places. And in the case of dark skies, this really comes down to how we deal with outdoor lighting. And as I say here, it should be the first thought in our planning and not an afterthought as it often is. And so the example image that's shown there is the lighting management plan for Brecon Beacons National Park in Wales, which was the first IDA dark sky place to be accredited in Wales about 10 years ago. The idea that there is a lighting plan, that we have systematically thought through the process of preserving this resource is very important. And then we can hold people accountable. We can say, we've set these priorities, we want to hit these targets, here's our plan for how we do that. And then we can assess that periodically and see how well we're doing. And third, I think we really need to incentivize people to participate. And in dark skies, that comes in a form of sustainable tourism that we've come to call astrotourism. And there are a few headlines there from different media outlets talking about how astrotourism has really taken off in recent years. And the idea here is that it is ultimately a form of rural economic development. If we can give people a reason to transition from extractive industries, especially those that have impacts to climate change, over to sustainable tourism, then all they really need to do to keep the source of their tourism revenue is to protect the resource. And then we encourage them to develop these plans, like the lighting management plan in Brecon Beacons, to maintain the integrity of the resource so that it can continue to produce for them. That means jobs, that means green jobs that are not harming the environment, but are helping restore it. And we think that is a win-win for everybody who's involved. So one way we can do this with the incentivization of dark sky conservation is to accredit places for the quality of their night skies. That is the nature of the International Dark Sky Places program. The little clouds here all have ideas for why it's important to accredit these places for their dark skies. Everything from helping raise awareness, again, back to the main job that an organization like IDA does, show them good examples of outdoor lighting, and build support for the broader mission. So we want people to think beyond just, we're conserving the darkness in our local park, to we should conserve darkness throughout the world. And along the way, we'll make access to this resource more available to people, and we will help establish these best practices that are part of the overall conservation scheme. So if we're doing this right, what we should see is that the dark places stay dark, and over time, the places that are not dark should gradually become dark. Again, we're trying to change the way people think about the use of artificial light at night. And if we can do that by drawing attention to the harm that it yields to these dark places, that may be the thing that changes some human behaviors in the process. So the program itself is now into almost its 21st year. In fact, this month, October, marks the 20th anniversary of the first designation that the program made in 2001 to the town of Flagstaff, Arizona, which is where I'm at here in the United States. And since then, over 180 designations have been made on every continent except Antarctica. And we have managed to protect about 108,000 square kilometers of land area, which is roughly the size of the West African nation of Benin. And that number is growing almost exponentially right now. The program has never been more popular than it is. And the program does a lot of things. The main thing that we hope it does is that it encourages more people to come into this movement, to protect these dark places, to work on the problem of light pollution in cities, and to create really this global network of places that can share their experiences, their talent, their resources, and that collectively they make the effort stronger than if they were all off working on their own individually. And we have some evidence that it's really achieving many of its goals in that regard. So it's not the only certification program in the world, but it's probably the best known program and the one that has accredited the most places. So when I'm talking about dark side places in the rest of the talk, generically, I'll be referring to this program. There are a number of benefits to accrediting with IDA in this program. Recognition internationally, every designation generates some interest in national and international media. So it helps draw attention to what people are doing. Again, it's that sustainable tourism benefit that I mentioned earlier that can be useful for the economic development of areas that are often otherwise economically depressed. There's the brand affiliation with IDA. IDA's reputation is really sterling internationally, and being associated with that can be good for a place that receives the accreditation. And part of the process is making improvements to outdoor lighting. And we think that that has benefits for the community. It certainly has benefits for wildlife. And over time, it will be, it means a reduction in dependence on resources like electricity that can help with regional and even global climate change goals. So we think there are a lot of good things about it, no really obvious downside. It's a win-win for everybody who participates. So broadly speaking, these are the goals. We want to preserve darkness where it remains, and we want to roll it back where it's been lost. And in the way of getting from point A to point B, we're bringing together this community that is rapidly growing throughout the world. A lot of people who work professionally in the conservation space now recognize dark skies conservations, and they're putting it alongside efforts that they make to conserve places for example, air and water quality. And we really are trying to reward effort that people make. We're not just making designations of dark places. We want to reward people for doing the right things to help preserve and protect those places. And along the way, we end up engaging the public. We want them to come see these places firsthand. We think that's what will move people to taking action. And even where they're unable to visit in person, in the same sense that not everybody in the world will come visit the Grand Canyon, for example, it's here in my home state, but it's become this iconic sort of example of the kind of natural places that we want to protect. And even from afar, I think one can appreciate the fact that they are protected. So that's really what the program is trying to do ultimately. We sort the candidate locations for accreditation according to their night sky quality. We do this by comparing the brightness of the night sky in these places to the brightness of the night sky in a location where there was essentially no artificial light pollution. That's this natural night sky brightness that's over on the left. And it's made up of light that's emitted in the Earth's atmosphere through natural processes, and then astronomical sources of light like starlight. And if you add that up, you get a minimum brightness of the night sky that's just set by nature. And that is something that we call a night sky unit. So just think of that as one unit of something. And we're going to compare the brightness of the night sky to that unit. And the picture on the right shows how that scale works and how we categorize the different kinds of places according to how bright their night skies are. So if you're one or two of those night sky units, you are what we would generically call a dark sky oasis. This is a pristine night sky, meters from the influence of artificial light. And then that scale ranges up. You'll notice that it's not linear. It goes from 1 to 2 to 5 to 10 to 20, et cetera, all the way up to, in the brightest cities, the night sky may be 1,000 times brighter than the natural night sky. And that's the places where it's going to be the toughest to try to roll it back. There's a lot of light in cities, and people have come to expect that. So initially, we kind of sort these places by their sky quality, and we use tools like this to try to figure out what that quality is. We further distinguish international dark sky places by their land use type. And what I mean by that is, how is that land put to human use? So broadly speaking, we have the built environment, which are our cities over there on the left. The focus in that case is on benefits to the humans that live in those cities, public safety, utility of the land. What can we use that land for to benefit our people? And then there's a whole completely different setting, which is a protected place. And here I've shown you the Milky Way over the Grand Canyon to suggest to that. And there, it's a lot more about wildlife and the impact of biology, the visual aesthetics of being in a place like this at night and how that can inspire people. And again, that sustainable tourism that brings people to these places, that's very important. There's a process by which the designations are made. This is very rigorous, as you can see by some of the notes here in the second column. This can take years to prepare a nomination to the IDA. There's a formal review process that I call a form of peer review, because it's people who themselves have previously been applicants to this program that look over things and make sure that the high standards of quality that we've set have been met. And eventually, if it passes that review, the newly accredited place is announced to the world through interactions with the media. And then the only thing that these places owe the IDA once the designation is made is an annual report every year. They submit an update about how they've been doing, whether they've installed any new lighting, how many visitors they've had, et cetera, to try to make sure that the promises that are made in the application process become promises that are kept on the other side of that. It's not easy to get through this program, admittedly. It's very rigorous, but I think a lot of people who have been through it have found it to be very worthwhile on the other side. So in the last few minutes of the talk, I'm going to come back to this idea of why Wales is special, tell you about its significance in the context of this dark sky conservation, and end with some ideas about how we could get to this dark sky nation status. So Wales leads the world. I have no hesitation in saying that. I'm very proud for all of you for having achieved this, because it's a very big deal. If you add up the land area of just the 3 locations in Wales that have achieved dark sky status with IDA, you come up to nearly 20% of the country's land area, which is under this formal protection that comes with an IDA designation. And that is remarkable. There is nowhere else in the world that is near that much. Here in the United States, where we have over 100 of all of the international dark sky places, it still amounts to less than 1% of our land area. So we have a long ways to go to catch up with Wales. It's really something to be proud of, and it puts Wales in a good place to claim this, this banner of being the world leader in dark sky protection, because it really is true. And more importantly, the nighttime darkness in Wales is largely defensible. So here's the same picture that I showed you earlier with the false colors overlaid on the map that shows you the brightness of the night sky, with the brighter skies being those warmer colors and the darker skies being cooler. And you'll notice that there's a lot of that blue and gray, those darkest skies off the coast. Obviously, there are no cities out there. So the sea is a natural barrier. We just simply can't develop it right now. And so it probably will remain this dark buffer that surrounds 2/3 of the country. The interior, where we have large designated landscapes like Snowdonia National Park and the Brecon Beacons, the landscape itself sort of doesn't lend itself very well to development. It's why traditionally the population lives more towards the coasts. That's good. It means that that land is likely to stay dark longer into the future. So the main concerns, of course, are the cities. Some of the light is coming from across the border in England, of course. That will take national level policy, I think, to resolve that. If you've been paying attention to the news in the last few years, you'll know that there's an all-party parliamentary group in Westminster that's now dedicated to trying to deal with this problem. And I'm very hopeful for what they might be able to achieve in helping reduce the brightness of some of the English cities that are on your border. There's also industrial activities down there in Pembrokeshire. I received an inquiry from them about a year ago about the possibility of designating the entirety of the traditional county as an international dark sky reserve. And the arrow there points to the main concern, and that's a large industrial terminal on their seaport. And the operators of the port seem inclined to participate and maybe make some changes to their lighting that could make that light less significant. But over time, we're going to have to deal with the cities, especially on the south coast there, because they are on the doorstep of beacon beacons. And if we want to preserve the darkness in the beacons for much longer, eventually we will have to reduce the brightness of some of those cities and towns. The other thing that Wales benefits from is having many protected and conserved lands. The picture on the left shows the national parks and the areas of outstanding natural beauty. We've already locked down the two biggest ones. There's an effort, as I mentioned, in Pembrokeshire to at least bring the area of outstanding natural beauty into the IDA program. Some folks in North Wales are working on the Dee Valley and the Clodion Range. There's also a number of what are called sites of specific scientific interest that are shown on the right, all of those red and pink and even some of the green and blue areas that have a different level of landscape protection, but it does have some legal effect. And I think between these two facts, that there's a lot of national parks and these other specifically protected areas, as well as these areas of scientific interest, that there's a great potential to expand the number of designated places in Wales very definitely into the future. And the other thing that Wales benefits from is that the Welsh population has really become sensitized to the issue. This is a series of headlines that I found just by Googling around in the Welsh media, at least the English language Welsh media. And these are just in the last year. I think probably more people know about this issue in Wales than in any other of the constituent countries of the United Kingdom, and certainly more than in a lot of other places in the world. So you start off with a lot of awareness that we don't have in other places. And I think that will be very conducive to furthering these conservation goals in the future. It's something that the population is beginning to internalize. This is part of what defines Wales. This is part of who we are as a people. And I'm feeling very good about that. And so in the last couple of minutes, let's talk about that dark sky nation idea that I threw out at the beginning. Could we somehow put a designation label on the entire country? So first, it begs the question of what a dark sky nation is. And these are some ideas that we've thrown out over the past couple of years in thinking about this. If IDA were to move to formally offering this category of certification, these are some of the topics that came to the forefront, that we would have to have a robust national policy that deals with lighting in the plan permission process so that there are clear rules that everybody can follow, and over time we can reduce the amount of light that's wasted. We certainly need to have that very wide awareness of the issue and strong support for dark skies. Wales certainly seems to have that already. There are a lot more opportunities to increase that as well. And a high percentage of the territory of that nation should be under some form of accreditation or protected status for dark skies that will help preserve that into the future. So if we end up with a dark sky nation category, it will probably have these broad areas as the criteria that make a country eligible for the label. There's a lot of ways that we might achieve this, ranging from national legislation to maybe coming up with some scheme where we subsidize or incentivize people retrofitting their old lighting that's not very good. Certainly we need to do a lot of education. And most importantly, the public have got to be involved in this. This has to be something that the people of Wales very proactively seek. IDA certainly would not make a designation where it wasn't wanted, and we would want to know what the concerns of the people are. Not everybody will be excited about this. Some people will be very fearful about it being too dark and that being unsafe, and we certainly don't want to make this a disadvantage to anybody. So we definitely want to bring the public into this from an early stage and have a lot of that input directly into the process. How will we know if it works? If the goal is to try to reduce a country's light emissions as the main output of a dark sky nation, how will we know that? Well, one way we can do that is with the satellite data that I've been showing you before. And we can add up the light in a certain region and say, how is that amount of light changing over time? So here's a different version of the picture that I showed you earlier. This is the light at night map of Wales, but I've removed the underlying physical map. And you'll notice that I've drawn a red shape around the cities and towns on the South Coast that has a land area of about 4,000 square kilometers. There's a website, you can do this for yourself online. You can draw a shape around an area and it will tell you how the amount of light the satellite has been sensing is changing through time. And the result for that shape is this chart here on the right. The technical details are not important. All I want you to pay attention to is that the years of time run across the bottom. There's a number along the vertical axis that is related to the total quantity of light that the satellite sees within the boundaries of that shape. And every one of those sort of turquoise colored dots is a measurement made in 1 month since 2013. And you'll see that this looks like it's doing well, like it's trending downward over time. Although there are a couple of details worth noting, and that in around 2017, the way that the satellite data were calibrated changed, and that resulted in all of the world's lights appearing to dim a little bit, which wasn't actually real. And there's also a problem, which is we transition from earlier lighting technology like the very warm sort of orange sodium lights that people are very familiar with to the new brighter, bluer LED lights that are now becoming common. The satellite that makes these measurements really does not see that blue light very well at all. And so we might also be getting the impression that things are decreasing for that fact. If we account for those things, I would say that the light emission from the towns on the South Coast is actually pretty steady over time. It seems to be pretty flat in about the past 10 years, and that's a good thing. So here's an example of how we might check this. And here I've taken the city of Cardiff. I took it because it's the largest by population. And so we expect that it will have the most light emission. And I said, what if we draw a boundary around Cardiff, we add up all the light, then we look at the population of Cardiff and how that is changing over time. And we can compute something like a light consumption per head of population. How much light is being consumed by each inhabitant in Cardiff? And if we work that out, what we get is in these units, it's about 0.03 per person. So that, let's say that becomes our benchmark. We want to hold the light emission of Cardiff to that 0.03 units per person through time. Well, we know from the last couple of UK census results that the population of Cardiff is growing at about 0.7% per year. So we can use that to project into the future. If we're hitting this target, what should be the light emission in Cardiff in the year 2030? So that allows for a total rate of change over that time of about 7%. This is back to this idea that we're not trying to take things away from people. We're not taking away the light that they need at night for very legitimate purposes. But we think by reducing the waste that we can ensure that even as the population of a city like Cardiff grows, its light emission will not grow excessively, and we'll be able to maintain the darkness in places like the Brecons, which are not very far away. So this is an idea of how we might set up a verification scheme, if you will, to know whether the policies and the best practices are doing what we want them to do. So as the last thing I want to tell you, I'm going to come back to the slide that I showed you earlier and remind you that Wales is special because it has this tremendous resource. It has this dark night sky across much of the country. But I want to modify my statement here because I wasn't showing you the entire picture earlier. Wales is special, but Wales is also threatened, like almost every part of the world is, and it's threatened by the growth of light pollution. And so in the earlier cropped version of this photo where you couldn't see the light on the farm in the foreground, it looked like the problem was very far away. It's the glow of the city on the horizon. But when you see the full picture, you realize that there are installations of light in Wales that are potentially harmful to this resource. But I'm convinced that Wales is headed in the right direction, that really it is setting an example for the rest of the world to follow. And if IDA ends up offering this label of a dark sky nation, I cannot think of a country that really deserves more. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I will tell you diolch from here in the United States, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thanks, John. That's very enlightening. But to that last picture you showed us, I think that was actually a lighthouse.
Oh, is that a lighthouse?
Yeah, that's Anglesey, isn't it?
Okay.
It's South Stack.
That could be.
Those little dots you're seeing on the horizon are actually island.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to share with you one picture before. So I'm going to have to stop you there a minute, sorry.
Okay.
And where have I put it? Give me a second.
John, that was brilliant.
Thank you, David.
I could do with you in my front and back pockets as as part of my work. And if we were in the building for this conference in Wales, I would try to open this special bottle for you. In fact, one of your slides touched on the fact that the local producers, this bottle has officially been launched today, and it celebrates the low light pollution of the Cambria Mountains and the percentage recently given to the landscape by our national conservation body, Natural Resources Wales. So you might have seen the Natural Resources Wales Dark Skies and Tranquility report recently, and their light pollution map of Wales.
Yeah, it's difficult, John, because I was looking at the map there, and you know I've been an advocate for this for a long time. But I believe some of the satellite stuff is very misleading at the moment, especially when you start looking at the like Anglesey, for instance, and the Cambrian Mountains and all down the English border, Pembrokeshire in particular, and I think you're mentioning Valero more than anything else was the terminal there. Now, even when you're near Valero, you're still getting spectacular views of the Milky Way because of the coastal nature of it. But Valero is smack bang in the middle of the national park as well. So it's a bit of a nightmare. But Pembrokeshire as a whole actually has a fantastic lighting policy because only the major towns are actually lit at night now. After 11 p.m, all the lighting goes off. It's phenomenal. You've got a similar situation in Powys. A lot of the lighting goes off there at night now, and that's the majority of the Cambrian Mountains. And you've also got these the new lighting that's been put up on Anglesey itself. So there's great efforts being made in Wales. I just wish we could get rid of Cardiff and Newport, make a big difference. But this picture here is one I wanted to show you because this shows a great proportion of Wales and how the night sky actually is represented. And you can see there's not many people living in Wales. They're all stuck in Cardiff, I think. But one of the things that really came to mind, I just put it down here. Due the monitoring of the blue light now that's coming from the LEDs that we have, how are we going to be addressing that in the future from a monitoring purpose?
That's a great question, Alan. I think in the long run, what we hope is that future satellites that are launched either by the US or by the European Space Agency to monitor the Earth, which to date have really been about looking at the daytime side of the Earth. And so the night is incidental to their design. That now that it's clear that there's much more interest in this, both among the public and the scientific community, that either NASA or ESA will be moved to really build us a satellite that's dedicated to this, or at least put an instrument package on a future satellite that will be more optimized for this kind of work, and so won't suffer from that problem of being blind to the blue light. As far as what we can do with what we have now, we have a much better understanding of the amount of light that's being missed. And so if we make a measurement and we measure a certain quantity, and we know something about the composition of the light on the ground, we can add in what's missing. But the challenge there is knowing, if we look at a particular part of the Earth, how much of that light is LED, which there's a problem here, obviously. How much of that light is the old sodium light? So we're getting there, and there are some specific projects underway right now to map that up, to say, if we measure this kind of signal from the ground, can we infer how much of it is LED and then know how much of a correction to apply? But I think we would really be best served with a new mission. And there's a possibility that we will get that mission in this decade, I think.
What about the ground-based studies, John, with the SQM meters that the IDA approved? Because we getting very contrasting data from those compared to the satellite imagery.
Right, and so you make an important point there, which is when we talk about the satellite observations, what the satellites are seeing is the light from the ground that makes it all the way through the atmosphere. And so it doesn't encounter any dust particles or air molecules along the way, but some of that light does. And when it does, it tends to be scattered back down to the ground. And that's, for example, in your photo that you showed near the horizon, all of that glow, that's the light that originated on the ground, was headed up to space, but then got scattered back down. That's what we can measure with specialized devices from the ground. So I'm making a distinction between what we call radiance, which is the light going up and out of the atmosphere, and something called luminance, which is the light coming back down that our instruments on the ground will measure. And our instruments on the ground are better at that. They don't suffer from the blindness to the blue light, but they do not sense all colors of light equally. And we know that the measurements are now becoming biased in certain respects as the colors of cities change.
Mm. Yeah, there's been a significant difference I've noticed along the M4 corridor with the new LED lighting. And it has had a significant impact on the Brecon beacons, but also Brecon beacons, you mentioned about the lighting management plan. I don't think they're actually following it themselves, which is an issue, which we'll talk about another time. But I'd like to thank you there, John. Excellent talk. Absolutely loved it. I think everybody's got a lot of information out there. There's a few people saying hello on Facebook as well, who you may have encountered in the past. But thanks again, John, and thanks, David, for introducing him. And I know the Cambrian Mountains there is probably one that could go for some kind of status in his own right. So just keeping David calm down a little bit now is going to be the job for the rest of the night. So thanks again, John, and speak to you soon, and all the best with the new venture. I'm sure it's going to be a success.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's really been a pleasure today, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the conference.
It's great. Thanks to Argo and Navis for supporting it, and the rest of the projects that are involved with it. So take care, John. Goodbye.
Okay.
And speak soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.